Welcome back to Philosophy for the People. We're joined once again with Dr. Jim Madden. Now that the semester is it officially over? Is it totally done now?
It's over, and this is a rarity that you would see me on campus when I'm not when I have no contractual obligation to be here.
Yeah.
Uh, but I wanted to print out a paper,
Mhm.
and things have been a little spotty in the Wi-Fi situation at home. So
Right. And why
came
use your own ink if you don't have to? Right.
yeah, and for the record, it's professional in case any of my employers are.
Of course, of course. So we're going to talk about transcendental arguments today,
Yeah,
and this is something that has intrigued me. I have to say, this is not something I spend a lot of time on, so I'm definitely
yeah,
going to be more of the student in this conversation. It's got a rich history. I mean, you do see transcendental arguments in Aristotle,
yep,
in Plato, Kant, obviously, and then you also see them issued in response to radical forms of skepticism. I know you've talked about
yep,
how you can make certain transcendental arguments against the simulation hypothesis and all. So they seem to serve a variety of
yep.
different functions, and I just wanted to explore the nature of this type of argument with you today, Jim, and have
Sure,
you take us on a little tour if that's all
cool,
right with you. I think it'd
cool.
be a fascinating conversation.
You
So
bet.
please.
Yeah, it's something that I've been like obsessed with for the last few years.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, what the hell?
Yeah.
So okay, so there's a number of ways we can look. So like you mentioned, Pat, we could look at transcendental arguments against sort of radical forms of skepticism. Okay, and I would even prefer to say I don't see a transcendental argument against skepticism as such. Okay, because we're gonna have to like do the typical philosophers thing, like what do you mean by skepticism? So
Yeah.
I don't think there's a transcendental argument that relieves me of worries of whether the can is actually green. Okay, all right.
Yeah. Hmm.
I do think there are decisive transcendental arguments, and this is where I'll get in trouble for saying they're decisive, but I do think there are decisive transcendental arguments to the effect that something like Descartes' evil demon hypothesis is indeed false.
Against the say like global skeptical
Yeah,
scenarios,
yeah,
but yeah, you're right.
yeah,
Localized skepticism, we still got
yeah.
to kind of handle that,
So I don't. Yeah.
case
So I
by
don't.
case. Sure.
The way
Hmm.
I put it is, I don't see that there's a transcendental. Well, be careful because Kant might do this, but we could have a transcendental argument that just attempts to demonstrate that, in fact, we are in contact with something outside of our own consciousness. Okay, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing we could do with a transcendental argument. Okay,
Cool.
another thing you might try to do, or I think maybe gets lumped in here, is a transcendental justification of our knowledge as knowledge. Okay.
And that's getting back to Plato and Aristotle, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think
Gerson's big on those. I've been big on
yeah,
Gerson lately, so
yeah,
Gerson's big on
yeah.
and yeah, and those. Mhm.
Yeah, I'd want to hear how he for maybe we could do this too, how he
I
thinks
I
of
can pull it
those
up at some point
yeah.
in the
Yeah, let's do
conversation.
it.
Yeah.
And then but then also I think you can make an argument, okay, like a transcendental argument for the existence of the subject, okay, the transcendental unity of our perception, okay, which is I think the most interesting contribution from Kant, right, on this.
Right.
Okay, and I think
Hmm.
those are all like different issues. Okay, so let me put aside transcendental arguments for knowledge. Okay,
Yeah. Hmm.
okay, for like propositional knowledge, and maybe talk uh, a little bit about transcendental arguments against a sort of global skepticism. I would say transcendental arguments against solipsism. Okay,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And like
and
one skeptical. These radically skeptical scenarios are really sort of structurally the same, right?
they're
Whether
all
you
yeah,
think it's
brains and vats
based in
simulation.
demons, AIs,
Yep,
aliens,
yep.
structurally they're the
It's all
same,
the
right?
same.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's all the evil demon, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
then we're able to talk about like what like Kant's transcendental deduction is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool.
Now, maybe real quick,
Yeah,
how do you define a transcendental argument? I've
yeah.
always understood it
So
as like searching out the necessary conditions for the possibility of something.
yeah,
How do you like to
yeah.
in
I think
simple
that's 100%
terms?
right, and that's
Mhm.
exactly how like Kant will define it. Though I think that definition isn't the most helpful because I think there are attempts to discover possibilities that are not transcendental arguments. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I
So,
do.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So the way I look at it is a transcendental argument is always a second order argument.
Hmm.
Okay. It's an argument about the status of the argument we're having.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? And now here's where the classical Kantian definition comes in is it's an argument about the status of the argument we're having that like puts into question what are the conditions that provide the possibility of our so arguing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Right. And so basically it says, look, the fact that we're having this argument cannot be denied now. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that I'm at least internally having this argument
Right.
cannot be denied now. And so and it seems like you've got to say that there's some kind of semantic grip in that fact. Okay, meaning like there's some true statement I'm making, right? Okay,
Right.
In even if it's like a solipsistic internal dialogue.
Yep.
And then the transcendental move is to ask, okay, so what would have to be in place in
Mhm.
order for that first order argument to have some kind of semantic grip?
Right,
Okay.
which it needs to even be coherent,
Which it
right?
needs to be even
You're
coherent.
clearly grasping the terms you're using in that even internal dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. And I think all transcendental arguments have that second order move. Okay, so here we are, we're debating this thing. Okay, well, what actually accounts for the possibility of there being such a debate? Not the actuality, just the possibility of there being such a
Right.
debate. And is that, and this is the move, right? Is that second order consideration consistent with both sides of the first order debate?
Mhm.
Okay, so if you got like I'm arguing A, Pat Flynn's arguing not A.
Yep.
Okay, and we're not getting anywhere. We've reached, say, an antinomy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ooh.
Right? We've reached an antinomy, and then we could ask ourselves,
Give
okay,
it to me, Emmanuel.
yeah, exactly. We've reached an antinomy, and we can't get any further. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Now the question is, well, what account? And then we could say, okay, let's kick it upstairs, and
Yep.
let's what accounts for the possibility of our having such a debate?
Right. Here are those necessary conditions,
Yeah,
and they
and
eliminate one of the options downstairs.
yeah,
Yep.
because
Mhm.
let's say it turns out like the first order debate Pat and I are having, my stance is not in fact consistent with the second order conditions, then it would seem like I've got to forfeit my position in the debate, right?
Right. Mhm.
Because okay, you see that, all right?
Yeah. Beautifully. That's a great explanation
Cool.
of a transcendental
Thank you.
argument.
Thank
Yeah, I very much prefer what you just stated over the more traditional
Cool. Well,
definition I give. Yeah. Mhm.
it's taken 30 years, so
Sorry.
yeah.
All beautiful things too. I'm over 30 now, and I finally got the
Exactly.
beard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. You're owning it, man. You're owning it. That boy. I like that on the new backdrop you've got. Is that a big
Yeah, dude.
Aristotle?
In fact, we're going to do a thing on AI soon. Part of this
Yeah.
is AI generated. See that little
Nice.
kind of face of mine up there? That was I put a couple
Oh, I didn't notice that.
yeah, dude. I put a few of my selfies in that AI image generator, and it threw out this weirdly futuristic thing of me that was. I'm like, all right, we'll throw that into a background somehow. So
I'm tempted
yeah.
to do that because then that'll provide a template for my wife's tattoo. So
yeah, no doubt, man. Yeah, maybe we'll have some fun at the end. We can try out some of the other not so successful AI generated images of me. But business first, yeah.
Okay, so that's a transcendental argument. All right, so let's just stick Kantian for now.
Sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So, and there's so all of Kant's procedures in the Critique of Pure Reason are transcendental like this.
Yeah.
Okay. Like he's asking. Okay. So basically Kant starts out with he's not gonna argue with you about whether we have scientific knowledge.
Mhm.
He's like, look, he's like, look, we got it. Newton got it. Unfortunately for Kant, he thinks that like Newton's basically it's a completed science.
It's done, right?
It's done.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we can close up the doors.
Mhm.
We just need to maybe work out some of the details, but Newton's going to get it.
Yeah.
He's waiting for Darwin to kind of happen too, right? Anyway, and so Kant thinks that he's got a completed science. He's not going to argue whether or not we have first order knowledge of nature, right?
Mhm.
But now but he's noticed that we're still getting some antinomies going on here, right?
Mhm.
Okay, we're getting like the classic, eternity of the world problems, right? We're getting free will versus determinism problems.
Mhm.
We're getting necessity versus contingency of nature problems. We're getting these antinomies. Okay, so there's first order conflict going on here.
Mhm.
Okay, now it's interesting. He doesn't think there's first order conflict as long as we follow the Newtonian method, right? Because we can just take it to the telescopes, man. Take it to the calculus, take it to the telescope.
We'll science it, dude.
Yeah, we'll science it up, right?
Yeah,
It's like I've been watching MythBusters with my kids. Right?
Yeah,
science.
Yeah, my kids love to use science as a verb too. We're gonna science this thing.
Science
I'm like, we're gonna science it. All right, yeah.
But we're getting first order contradictions in metaphysics and epistemology. Okay, so I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that because I want to talk about the transcendental deduction. Okay,
Yep.
so what does Kant do in the critique? He goes through, all like he wants to build up. Well, how is it he starts out with basically what is scientific knowledge? It's Newton. Now I want to reverse engineer the conditions necessary for us to get to that. Okay.
Yes.
So he's going transcendental on like, okay, so I've got scientific knowledge. What are the higher order conditions that allow it to happen?
Right.
Okay.
Since we have this knowledge, it's actual. It's because it's actual. It must be possible. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility?
For the possibility of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So make that move up. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Kant says, well, okay, so what's going on in scientific knowledge? It's not trivial. Okay, so it's synthetic, right? It's not merely analytic.
Mm-hmm.
So there must be some empirical content to it somehow,
Mm-hmm.
but yet it's necessary. So there must be conceptual content to it.
Yep.
Okay. And you get the transcendental aesthetic, which is not about art because that's not actually what the word means. Okay. The transcendental aesthetic is Kant's explanation of the a priori higher order conditions for us having empirical experience. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's where you get famously his arrival at the space and time as transcendental conditions for sensation. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, okay, that's great, but knowing isn't just sensing, right? Okay. Thank you very much, David Hume. But it's not just sensing; it's also necessity. Okay. It's also it's so the way I would put it, and this is kind of me parroting Sellers and Brandom, okay, from whom I've learned my Kant mostly, right? Is it like sensing alone doesn't necessarily have logical entailments, right? Whereas like Newton gives us logical entailments. Okay. So in addition to the sensing, we've got to have logical entailment. So there must be another condition that must be met. And this is, the conceptual component. Okay.
Right.
So then Kant then begins a transcendental deductive argument as to what are the conceptual conditions for there to be knowing, and he arrives at the 12 categories. He has 12 categories rather than 10. Okay, but he arrives at his ultimate set of categories that must be in the background for us to have at the second order level for us to have first order scientific knowledge. Okay? Right. Deduces it away. Now, here's what gets maybe interesting for us in some ways here. Well, this is all interesting for us, but I mean, this is what I'm most interested in this moment in Kant. So why does Kant think we need because he deduces two things. He deduces concepts, right? And then ultimately deduces ultimate concepts because he can't go on forever. But then he also deduces a transcendental subject. Okay. All right. And so what Kant is going to argue here is, okay, so what's an inference? Well, an inference is, we discover S is P, okay? And then we can infer from that, right, that S is not P or something like that. Okay, that's trivial, right? But scientifically, we can make like non-trivial stuff, right?
Right.
And so I discover that S is P under these conditions, but understanding the concept of P tells me that S is not P under certain other conditions. Okay. And what Kant finds interesting here is the inference requires an application beyond time and space. Right. So like to say I'm making deductive inferences from my first order scientific empirical claims is to occupy a position that's transtemporal and transspatial.
Yes.
Right. You see that? Like, so the inference itself, it finds concepts interesting, not because of like Aristotelian, and I think it's unfair. So it's like Thomistic abstraction kind of arguments. He finds them interesting because they presuppose a transtemporal, transspatial perspective in order for their application, right?
Yeah.
To say that this thing has mass is to understand what it would do under all conditions where mass can occur. Does that make sense? Across time and space. Okay. So the application of the concept presupposes the concept itself is something transtemporal and spatial, right? But then the application of it assumes a perspective, a subject that is transtemporal and spatial.
Spatial, right? Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So for Kant, in order for there to be an application of the concepts that give science necessity, there's got to be something outside the system of
That's
space and time.
Extra scientific in that sense.
Extra
right?
scientific. Yeah. Okay. Now, what can we say it? And he always says, like in another, and I'm going very fast on that things here, but he says, in any application of a concept, there's an I think that accompanies it. Okay. What he means by that, it's not the Cartesian I think. It's that It's that this is done from a perspective,
Mhm.
right? And it's a perspective that is not itself an object of the sensation that's being put into the concept here. Do you see that? Okay. So there's always this unstated I think, this unstated I think, this unstated I think that's always implicit in any conceptual application, in any subsequent inference, any syllogism, any scientific prediction, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
Okay. And note for Kant, then, for us to do this, right, there has to be a non-empirical self that's sitting outside of the whole thing.
Mm.
Do you see that? Okay. So for Kant, whatever subjectivity is, okay, in as much as it is a subjectivity that can ground natural science, right? It's a subjectivity that stands outside of any possible scientific description.
Right. So there's an immediate consequence there against scientism of the subject.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now we have to be careful of it. So, like for Kant, though, he's going to divide the empirical subject from the transcendental subject.
Sure.
Okay. So he doesn't doubt that, you in time and space, you in the succession of association of mere intuition, all that stuff can be studied scientifically, can be accounted for in a deterministic science, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
But he would say, come what may, there is something sitting outside of that that's taking the perspective.
Yes.
Did you see that? And what can be said of it? Nothing theoretically can be said about it, because it is the transcendental condition of all theoretical saying.
Yeah.
Right. And then later he's going to begin to say you can describe it morally, right? You can describe it in the second critique, right? But you can't describe it in the first critique because it's the conditions of saying. It's not something that can be said about.
Yeah. So to situate Kant in his context, obviously Hume is a target of Kant, right? So he's at various points, he's interested in, objects like the hand, right? And it seems like, we were able to grasp this object as a hand, right? But only because we've encountered it through different perspectives and stuff like that. And then there's something that bundles it together. The problem is for the human, he's got a bundle, but nothing that can do the bundling, right? So everything sort of falls apart on that first.
Here's how I would put it is Kant looks at Hume and says, hey, but you're still making inferences, son.
Yes.
Okay. And you still have and of course, like in fairness to Hume, he's got his nominalist account of conceptuality, right? But Kant is going to push and say, but still, he thinks that's self-referentially going to be a problem, right? Okay, and so you need this kind of grounding in an a priori reason, okay, in Kant's terminology, to make sense, because like here's think of it this way: you've got Hume and you've got, really for Kant, Leibniz having an argument. Okay. And he's going to say, okay, you guys have reached an antinomy. Let's go second order, right?
Yeah.
Okay, look, Hume, there has to be a transcendental subject, and you cannot account for that, or your position is inconsistent with it.
Yes.
You see what I mean?
Right.
Okay, and hey, Leibniz, guess what? Without some sort of empirical grounding, your position is trivial, so you're inconsistent with it too. You see? So I interrupt you, right? But
yeah, that's great. No, that's a great point of clarification.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's move forward with applications then, because I think that was some really awesome stage setting, and like you said, you've been sort of obsessed with transcendental arguments in different contexts. So continue the tour here, Professor.
Sure. Okay. So that's the classic 10-cent version of Kant's deduction of the transcendental subject in the first critique. Okay.
Now, one more thing about that is how far or how consistently do you think? I think most people, if they encounter a transcendental argument and they understand it, are probably going to go along with it, right? But there's always somebody who's going to try and dig their heels in, right?
Yeah.
And continue to bite the bullet or resist as far as they can. I don't know if this is the best time to address that, or if we should wait till we get to the more ferociously skeptical scenarios, right? I'm talking like the Pyrrhonian skeptic type of situation.
Well, when you ask though, like, what do you do with Kant's like deduction of the transcendental subject? I mean, there's a perfectly good sense in like nothing, okay, because like it leaves the empirical psychology alone. It's like, okay, go ahead and do that. You're not talking about the transcendental subject. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And what can be said about it? Nothing, right? Like I mean, think of it like Wittgenstein's Tractatus is in many ways operating in a similar way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you end up saying, yeah, there's got to be a subjectivity outside of all empirical verifiability, or above all empirical verifiability, to make sense of the conditions of empirical verifiability. But then what can be said about it if you take the Kantian move, right? Nothing can be said about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so then, and then this is going to leave us like, now note, like for Kant, this becomes transcendental idealism, because our only access to the real is through our subjectivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no like you're no longer able to like parse out what is our contribution in the world's contribution from knowledge now. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so it becomes, this begins the whole drama of German idealism. Okay,
Right. Mm-hmm.
right, and I think you can see like there's a very interesting anthology. I should remember the editor's name on German idealism, and pretty much the only thing he gives you from Kant in it is the transcendental deduction of the subject. And I found that very curious at first. But now I get why, right? Because I think now everyone, like Fichte, and if you want a good explanation of this, Fichte's Vocation of Man is this incredibly accessible little book that he wrote for a popular audience that lays out this in his own version of it, right? But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at Fichte and Hegel, and then going in Schopenhauer, definitely, it is all an attempt to like go through the consequences of the transcendental deduction of the subject. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Now let me switch now to like more recent fare. Okay. And because I don't see Kant in any way like trying to refute a simulation or an evil demon kind of hypothesis there. In fact, he actually leaves us with one, right? Like, so it's like the world is like our simulation now. It's like it's seen through our subjectivity. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, I want to be careful because there are realist readings of Kant, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are, of course, one of my, in fact, I've got him right here, right? Many Thomists who pick up in the tradition of Kant, Bernard Lonergan's insight, right? He's somebody who takes Kant very seriously, rather than other Thomists who just want to say, like, look, don't play this game to begin with, or else you're not ever going to be able to get out of it. No, Lonergan's like, no, we can play it, and it can be very fruitful, in fact.
And I actually think to say don't play the game, otherwise you're never get out of it, is to like ignore the fact that the scientific revolution happened.
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, like, we have to admit, like, look, it turns out, the straightforward, signet ring and the wax story about knowledge it's not going to work now. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right. Just as Norris Clark talking about, like popping a bean out of the machine right into your own.
Yes, exactly.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I do. But
which Clark argues is a total straw man against Thomas's actual theory of knowledge. But yeah.
And so I'm gonna kind of parrot Hillary Putnam here, who is though a sort of realist, sort of Kantian.
Yeah.
Okay? All right. Anyway, so Putnam has a famous paper called Brains and Vats. Okay. Mm-hmm. Which then becomes a central theme in his book, Reason, Truth, and History. But man, his presentation of this in Reason, Truth, and History is very tough. Okay, mm-hmm. So if people want to follow this up, I would go ahead and find yourself a copy of Brains and Vats. I can't remember where it's anthologized somewhere, but anyway. So
sure. Mm-hmm.
And this is an idea that's been immensely important in my own thinking, which maybe is less important to people, but this is like one of the seminal things like that kind of like got me turning a certain way. Okay. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Putnam entertains the brain and vat scenario, right? Mm-hmm. So, for all we know, could we just beat brains and vats? But I think you could make the same case for all we know, could we be in a simulation by a computer, right? For all we know, could we,
could this all be put on by advanced intelligent aliens, stuff like that, right?
Or could, for all we know, could we be being tricked, by an evil demon, whatever. Okay. And of course, like Putnam's position is like immensely controversial, and there's like a 20-year literature on it, blah, blah, blah. But I'm just going to lay it out there and admit I'm kind of a partisan in this thing. Okay.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
So Putnam's original paper is funny. Okay. So he starts out where he says, imagine, I think it's an ant walking around the beach. Okay. And the ant just so happens to trace out like the shape of like a cartoon image of Winston Churchill. Mm-hmm. Okay. And Putnam asks, okay, so if no one ever saw that image, would it actually be about? Would it have semantic grip on Winston Churchill? Okay. And Putnam thinks it's just obvious it would not. And I agree with him, right? Okay. So like accidental arrangements do not make for, like semantic grip in an image or a word or what have you, right? Or let's just say, like I drop my pen and it like makes a squiggle on a piece of paper here. Does that have semantic grip? Not unless it's something outside of it happens to give it semantic grip.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, so we're going to say it's got to be some intention on our part, okay, that provides the image of Winston Churchill with semantic grip, and then like kind of begs the question of what is an intention, okay? Now, let's leave that the kind of the metaphysical question aside for a second, okay? So at this point, Putnam thinks he's kind of got you hooked, okay? All right, so you're going to, obviously you're going to admit, that the ant happening to trace out Winston Churchill is not a semantic event. Okay, all right. And so then he says, okay, I think he goes to it because he figured out this like whole twin earth kind of argument, and he used it in everything, right? And it's an effective kind of argument.
Don't you love it when somebody like really gets their pet argument and just like trots it out again and again?
Yeah, I mean, good luck getting
guilty.
Good luck getting me to do anything without talking about Zeta and thinking about Paris, right? Right. Okay, and which, by the way, I mean, what I'm doing is very much like, in the vein of what Putnam's up to.
Yeah.
Okay, so Putnam says, I think you go to a planet, and in that planet, the people have images, right? And I can't remember what the example is. Let's say they have images of bunnies, okay? But there's never been a bunny on that planet. Okay, they've never like talked to anyone, right? Okay, that's been to a bunny planet. They just so happen to have images of bunnies. Okay, do those have semantic grip? And Putnam says no, they don't. Okay, because like what Putnam's leading to here, and this is I think a very important point, is how you get the image or how the word gets on the paper makes the difference for whether or not it has semantic grip.
Yeah.
Okay, so if it's just by some quirk of, albeit unlikely, brain chemistry, these people have images of bunnies, right? That's not enough to make them about bunnies. Okay. There might not have ever been bunnies, but that went thereby these would not be about bunnies, right? Okay. And so what's the difference between, say, Pat Flynn and Twin Pat, on Twin Planet, on Twin Earth, right? Is that Pat Flynn is in some kind of causal contact, right, with bunnies, right? Or with something. It doesn't, in this word, we're not trying to like prove knowledge, right? With something like maybe it turns out like our concept of bunny is way off, right? But it has semantic grip because it was gained in a certain causally significant way.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. There's something outside of the image itself is not enough to justify it as having semantic value. That's what Putnam's up to here.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So then he says, now, okay, with all that in the background, he's going to go back. If I remember, I spent a long time to look at the paper, but he's going to go back and say, look, let's go with the brains of vat scenario. Okay. All right, so here you are, your brain and vat, and supposedly, and you've got to have like the concept or the notion of brain to do this. Okay. All right. What makes that a legit concept of brain and not something like bunnies on Twin Earth or ants' pictures of Churchill?
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, and so Putnam would say you could only say it had that, like you have a concept like that concept of brain in that you're thinking as you entertain the brain of that scenario has semantic grip if it's in contact with something outside of itself. It's not just the image.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so in that case, he would say there has to be something outside of the brain in the vat scenario that you're in contact with in order for you to coherently even state the brain in the vat scenario.
In which case you are not the brain.
In which case you're not just a brain in a vat.
Right.
You're like like you know what I mean? Like you might be a brain in the vat, but you've got to be causally linked to something beyond that.
Yes.
You see what I mean? And so like this, I think that I find this like much more like there's interesting objections to Putnam's because like, oh yeah, you're in contact with the scientist, right? You're in contact with the water in the vat and all that. To which I say, yeah. So it turns out like what is or is not a human body engaged in the world is going to be a question that we're going to have a hard time answering. And so like therein is the drama of science now. Do you see what I mean? Okay. But the point is like you're not just an isolated mind thing now.
Yes. Right.
You know what I mean? It's solipsism is false, right? Like Okay, and so if you adjust it to
Can't
like,
be just you and a demon, and that's it, right?
yeah, exactly, and it can't. And like if you go with the computer simulation, okay, so are there ideas of computers in the simulation hypothesis? Yeah, okay, but all right. So if they have semantic grip, then I must be in touch with something beyond the simulation hypothesis,
Yeah.
right?
This is subtle, but I think brilliant.
Yeah, and the way I put it is, it's a little different from Putnam's though. Is like, and actually I have a section of this in the new book. Is I say, look, if that I'm in the simulation is not merely a simulation, right? Like, you see what I mean? Like,
It can't be, according to what's
it
just been said
can't
here.
be, right? Right? Like that I'm in a simulation cannot merely be in the simulation. That would be self-defeating because then I wouldn't really be in a simulation, right? So you can't. So if you're going to say I'm in the simulation, you've got to say there's at least one fact you're in touch with that goes beyond the simulation, namely the fact that you're in the simulation. Right? That's a second order fact, right? Not a first order fact. That's why I think of it as like it's kind of a transcendental argument. You've got to account for that, right? And now it doesn't mean I know anything about what's outside the simulation, but I just know this: there's something outside the simulation, right? Might be a Kantian noumenal realm or something like that, but there's something beyond.
It's not simulation all the way down.
It's not simulation all the way down. Okay. Now, if you want to say, yeah, okay,
Sorry,
yeah,
Elon Musk.
yeah, exactly. Sorry, but if you want to say, oh, well,
I don't think
yeah,
he really believes. I don't think anybody
no,
really believes the simulation hypothesis.
but but if you say, well, okay, yeah, like the aliens running the computer are out there, yeah, fair enough, I agree. But now you've opened the question, right, to what we can know and what we can't know outside of the simulation. So we should start doing some science on that, which is to say, keep doing science.
Right. And there's also like this is a separate consideration, but there's also like this other deep issue of self-defeat. It seems like everything that we've used to sort of build up the simulation hypothesis is based upon a fake empirical investigation. Do you see what I mean? Right. Which is like there's no reason to think that any of this is actually the case concerning computers or consciousness, because if it's all being simulated, then there's no reason to take it. Right. You see,
there is the presumption in the background that like we could have like machine consciousness, right?
Oh, that too. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of, I think, other issues. I actually think you're probably better off if you're trying to push a radical skepticism to go with demons than AI or something like that, right?
And also, another way I have about it, this is different from the argument I just made, is if you say, okay, like it's been a long time since I looked at it, but like, what's his name? Bostrom, the philosopher who first came up with this, right?
Yep.
Like he does the probabilities, like, well, given the likelihood of like continued human evolution and in the background of what we would expect humans to do in the future, he arrives at a certain probability. Okay, fine, but here's the deal: you've got to say now the mathematics of probability is part of the simulation. Do you see what I'm saying?
Including all the science we have of evolution and right.
So what makes you think that like the mathematics that you're using to set these probabilities of how likely it is that we are or are not in the simulation apply beyond the simulation?
Or evolutionary factors.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he has a self-reference problem here, I think. And maybe it's in the literature. So, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but it seems to me, if you say, okay, I'm going to give you this probabilistic argument of how likely it is that we're in the simulation, but then that means the very logic by which you arrive at that argument is part of the simulation. So why would you think that applies beyond the simulation? Do you see what I mean? In which case you're still appealing to something outside of the simulation.
Right. You're going to have to, if you want that logic to have grip. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to be careful. It's like, I think we could end up, because, like we're really, really wrong about the character of reality. Right. Okay. And maybe it turns out there's like an information-based physics that's going to come along and show us that the analogy, the metaphor with computer simulation is the right way to think about the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but that's different from the simulation hypothesis. You see what I mean? It's all just a simulation, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And and also, to be fair, I know you know this, Shin, but for listeners, there's different like versions of the hypothesis, right? There's like matrix like versions, like maybe you're hooked up to something, and then there's versions where there's actually just no you aside from what's generated by the computer whatsoever, right? But I think these considerations are going to kind of apply across the board, right?
And I just think all of these, like, kind of going back to Kant in a way, right? Although once again, like Kant Kant would be a funny place to like try to avoid the simulation hypothesis, right? But going back to Hegel, definitely what Hegel does with Kant's position is to say we're ignoring the transcendental conditions of our even entertaining the hypothesis in the first place, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. What other applications have you found interesting or useful for transcendental arguments? And if you want, I can try and pull up a little bit of Gerson on Plato and Aristotle as well.
Yeah, I'd like to see what Gerson is calling a transcendental argument in those guys.
Yeah, let me see if I can get it.
I guess I can see it with the Platonic forms, right? To say, look, in order for us to make sense of the sorts of claims, like think of the argument of Phaedo, right? In order for us to make sense of the kinds of claims that we make, right? Yep. We could not have arrived at these concepts empirically. So then, like Plato's going to give you, or Socrates in the Phaedo is going to give you.
Let me read, if you won't mind. Let me read a very thick paragraph from Gerson, and then if this and then you can just either react to it or not. And if not, we'll just save it for a wider conversation. But this is probably one of the most relevant launch points. So I'm just picking up in the middle of something here. So Gerson says, apart from the dialectical argument that most plausible claimants to knowledge cannot actually be knowledge according to the hypothesized criteria, Plato does, in fact, offer a transcendental argument for the definition of knowledge as the inerrant cognition of what is which is at the same time an argument that we do in fact possess exactly this. This is the argument from recollection set forth most explicitly in Phaedo, but also referenced in Meno. The argument is elegant in its basic structure and is simple. There is a certain cognitive activity that we could not perform unless we had knowledge. We can perform this activity, therefore we must possess knowledge. The cognitive activity Plato is referring to is the identification of a group of items that A, are correctly said to have a certain predicated of them, and B, are nevertheless deficient with regard to the nature indicated by the predicate. Therefore, equal sticks or stones may be said to be equal at the same time that it is recognized that their equality is deficient equality. The deficiency resides in the fact that any account of the attribute in them, in virtue of which the predication is made, will be compromised because it must include information that would necessarily be in the account of a contrary predicate. I could keep going if you want, or maybe that just gives you a flavor
that's exactly what I had
where
in mind.
Gerson's going with it.
That's exactly what I had in mind, and this is totally consistent with what Gerson's saying there.
Yep.
It's not a guy I'd want to disagree with on Plato either, right? So, and also remember, like, he is not saying, Plato is saying, like, we have a completed list of these forms. I think this is like a misreading of Plato.
Oh, totally. Right? Yeah, Gerson's not saying that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
What Plato is saying is there must be some ultimate perspective from which we view things, in as much as we're getting anything right. You know what I mean? And I think what's interesting is for Plato, though, that is going to ultimately be a it's like to occupy is like to look away, right? You know, like you're not going to apply it back, right? Well, I don't know. I've started reading the Timaeus. I'm starting to think differently about Plato in that way. But anyway, I digress there. But do you know what I mean? So I think, though, like people do Plato a disservice by saying there's these transcendental conditions of knowing, the forms, and he's got a list of them.
Plato, here they are coming to the museum.
Exactly, coming to the museum. Plato claims no such thing, and if you look at how he tries to investigate it, he goes to like ordinary language, which he's admitting is this fluid, becoming mess of things, right? So, like, what and how many forms there are for Plato, I think, is a much more interesting question than it's made out to be. Yeah,
totally.
Right. Yeah, I like how you said, like, it's as if he's got this museum of forms that he's going to like take you to. That he's like, Yep.
Cool. Anything else you want to say on that, or should
no?
We
that's it.
Questions?
That's
good.
I've probably said way too much already. So.
No, this was a great, and we can explore this further. But I wanted to do an introductory episode on transcendental arguments, and I think that you did just a fantastic job as always, Professor. So thank you.
I think if you want a great example, like if I may just do, if you don't mind, like my favorite transcendental argument is in the introduction to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And he goes through the Humean Kantian thing, and it's starting to sound like we've like lost contact with reality. Okay. And Hegel says, like, hey, don't worry, little guy, it's okay, right? Because he says, because we can go around.
Calm down, baby.
Yeah, we
Calm
can go
down.
around. We can go around the back of consciousness, he
Right.
says. And how do I know that? Well, because he says it, we could not be having, you couldn't be understanding the introduction to what my book is going to claim. You could not understand the introduction to my book unless we had the absolute knowing that I'm going to try to demonstrate to you through this book.
Right. Yeah.
You see that?
And you couldn't even coherently deny what I'm saying without that condition chain, right?
And and so I've seen a couple of questions come up on the side here about, in what sense. Kevin asked, should I just pull it up?
Yeah, let's pull it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kevin's question here.
Yeah. How is this idealist Kantian perspective different from solipsism, or is it different? I mean, that's a controversial matter, right? Like, people argue about the degree to which, like, Kant, like, pushes us into a solipsistic direction, right? But I think a thing to note is, like Kant, I don't think Kant's a solipsist, actually. Okay. I'm not saying, like, you're crazy if you read Kant this way, but, like, he does say these intuitions have to come in, right? There have to be these intuitions, right? And if they're going to be non-trivial, right? Okay, it seems like they can't be my doing. All right. So I do think Kant is saying there's got to be something, like there's no thinking for Kant without sense, right? Okay. At least in the theoretical mode. Okay. There's no thinking without sense, and the sense cannot be utterly generated by me. Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be analytic now. It would be, okay, we'd just be in our own little circle. Okay. Okay. So I do think Kant is not a solipsist. I think, and so when people, there's debates about, like, how serious was Kant about the noumenal world. Okay. Well, one, if you read the second critique, he's serious as a heart attack. He thinks, like, you're out there as a moral agent, right? And so is God and the soul and all this. Okay. But even in the first critique, I think he's saying, this transcendental object X, this thing, he calls it transcendental object X, right? There's this thing, and it's in the noumenal realm, and it's like you're encountering it, right? He's not even going to say how many there are or what their character is, because that presupposes the conceptuality. But it does seem something outside of you has got to generate that initial sensory input to get the thing going.
Yeah.
So I personally don't read him as a solipsist.
I agree. I do not think. I definitely don't think he was a solipsist. Now whether his position, like, inescapably leads to it is another question. But I think the answer there is also no.
And also then, and I do think what you get then in, like, the later idealists, especially Hegel, right, definitely will take you in a non-solipsistic route, because, like, Hegel does things that consciousness cannot define itself without some contrast point, and I think he's right about this. So my self-consciousness, the fact that I'm here self-consciously aware of myself worrying about solipsism, for Hegel entails that there's another consciousness I'm in contact with that I'm contrasting myself with. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Long story there. We could do that sometime.
No, this is what we're here for. We're here to explore and dig around and have fun. Let me pull up Paris's comment here. Paris is really talking about a position that I thought was my position for a while on Kant. It was a tentative position because as I've admitted to you and on this podcast, Jim, many times, I have more questions when it comes to Kant than I do definitive answers on anything. He's always confused me. But over time, I've come to realize I don't think I have Kant quite right, and I'm trying to understand Kant better. But the objection essentially comes down to this, and please make sure I'm representing you fairly. But Mortimer Adler says the same thing. He says Kant's fundamental problem is that he should have went back and reversed the poor trajectory of philosophy at the time, rather than, like, try to develop a new solution that essentially kind of just blended errors. And it sounds like Paris is kind of echoing a similar sentiment there. I can highlight the other comments that Paris brings up here as well, but maybe Jimmy just want to offer some quick thoughts on that.
Yeah. So Paris says he essentially agrees. I think it's Kant, right? He essentially agrees with the rationalist that the fundamental categories by which we carve up reality cannot come from experience and must be innate. Yeah. I mean, the 12 categories, but I mean, I even want to be careful with Kant, like, with innateness. Like, innate to what? The empirical subject? No. Right? The transcendental subject? Yes. Okay, that's a very important point. Like, so Kant would be willing to say, like, the categories that empirical human beings operate by, right? Like lower level stuff, colors, sounds, smells, what is an electron, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all earned empirically for Kant. He just thinks that, like Plato, there's got to be this, like, deep backdrop to that of formality, right? that allows for the application of concepts at all, right? I think it's an important thing with Kant is like what the categories are for Kant are the conditions for conceptual application. There can be no application of a concept without these categories operating. Do you see it? Okay. I think that's important because it's not like he's. That seems to me to be when you put it that way, it seems a lot more interesting claim than just like to say that he's like trucking out, Cartesian innate ideas. Do you see my point, right?
Totally.
What he's saying is there's got to be a condition in order for us to have conceptual application. There's got to be there's got to be a condition met for conceptual application, and that cannot be arrived at the same way other concepts are arrived at, because otherwise you're going to have a circular problem, right? Right? Do you see that?
Yeah, right. I do.
Yeah.
And Priest just highlights where was it here? Phaser, a quote from Edward Phaser: the standard scholastic position following Aristotle was that there is a sharp difference between intellect on the one hand and sense and the imagination on the other. Does Kant disagree with that fundamentally? I never gathered that he does. I mean,
so.
that's right. Think of like Hume's quote, right? Of let any man conceive of a triangle which is neither isosceles nor scalene, right? And soon he'll come to see the absurdity of all the scholastic ideas of general ideas, right? And of course, the scholastic response to that, which I think is right, is that, look, Hume's just failing to differentiate between intellect and sense there, right? We can't image a triangle without engaging say the sense power or the imaging power, imagination, right? But that's not what understanding is, right? So it's only if you collapse these two or fail to draw that distinction do you wind up with the alleged absurdities of Hume. But again, I'm not an expert on Kant, but I never thought Kant would deny that necessarily. But Jim, maybe you could clarify.
Yeah, I mean, only in the sense that he's going to say that intuitions without concepts are blind, and concepts without intuitions are meaningless, right? In that, like these things have to go hand in hand, right? But I do think Kant would say we can distinguish them as different objects of intentional objects, different kinds of intentional objects,
Good questions, Parisa, and Kevin as well. Let's go to this one from Dominic. Can we formulate a transcendental argument in a deductive form like a contingency argument does? Or does the metaphysic presuppose God in order to get off the ground at all, so that this isn't possible? Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I can think of, Jim, in the literature of contingency arguments are like these possible cause arguments, these modal possible cause arguments. I don't know if we would classify them as transcendental, but the idea being like, hey, if this contingent entity is actual, then it's possible. And if it's possible, what are the necessary conditions for a contingent entity? It must be, that in which essence is its existence, or throw out whatever you want there, right? And there's some interesting developments of the types of arguments. So I don't know. Do you see those as bearing a family resemblance to transcendental?
Yeah, I haven't looked at those arguments in any detail, right? But if you want to stay Kantian here, right? Kant in the second critique is going to give you a transcendental argument for the existence of a good God, right? For the existence of a perfect being, based on the conditions necessary for moral judgment, in his view, right?
Yeah.
Or I should be careful that like based on the conditions for like the moral life making sense. Okay. So I think you do. That's an example of somebody trying to make a transcendental argument for God's existence, right? Like help yourself to disagree with what Kant does there.
But they've certainly been deployed. Yeah.
They've been deployed. Yeah. And now I think for me, maybe more interesting when you take the first critique perspective, and this is something you're going to see happen in Fichte and other idealists, and in even like contemporary inheritors of that, people like Bernardo Kastrup, who I increasingly find to be a fascinating dude.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get this transcendental subject. Okay, it's outside of space and time. Okay, so exactly how are Pat's transcendental subject and Jim's transcendental subject different? Not really at all, right? Okay, because it's the empirical differences that individuate us, right? Okay, and so like what you're moving to here is like for Kant, there's a stream here. And I'm not saying Kant goes there, but like some of his inheritors do. That there's like really the perspective of the transcendental subject is the perspective of like an ideal rationality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that constitutes the world by its perspective. Okay, so in what sense that is or is not the God's eye perspective? Well, it literally is the God's eye perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether the degree to which it is or is not God, I mean, it becomes like some pretty interesting theological questioning to be done there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you're going to get like the God of like Orthodox, Judeo-Christian religion out of it, right? But I do think you're going to get something like, the sorts of idealist views that are sort of supernaturally friendly, like supernatural word, but that are friendly to religious sort of interpretations, like you see in a lot of the German idealists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
compatibility there, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, certainly trouble for a naturalistic worldview, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. It's the interesting thing on that is I don't know because keep in mind for Kant, um, is the naturalistic worldview can go very well on its own, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he doesn't think you need anything supernatural to like until we get to the third critique, it becomes more complicated. But in the first critique, it does not seem, well, even the first 3/4 of the first critique, it doesn't seem like you need anything supernatural to like come in and provide explanation for what goes on within the natural world. Like, so if you want to take the definition of naturalism as like C.S. Lewis's, and maybe we could do better than that, but if you're going to take C.S. Lewis's to say, like what naturalism is the whole show runs itself. And you don't need any external intervention to account for it. Kant would say, yep, you're right. Yeah, totally. You know what I mean? But Kant would say, like, the conditions of our observation of it are a different story, but not a story we can really tell, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is that naturalism or not? I don't know. And I think that's been one of the big questions for Kantians ever since.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I'm not enough of an expert on Kant to say, right? But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just take naturalism to be the view minimally that there's
Yeah.
nothing divine, right?
Yeah.
And it comes with a host of other commitments. One of those commitments, I think, is nominalism. I'm with Gerson. I think Gerson makes brilliant arguments. Like if you're not a nominalist, you're just not a naturalist, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that, in the sense
Yeah.
that that's incompatible with Kant, which I think it is,
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
right?
Right.
Then
Yeah.
it's trouble for naturalism,
Yeah.
right? Mm-hmm. All right.
So
Yeah.
I just think with Kant, it's not that he is or isn't a naturalist. I think for like once you like look into Kant, you might see like it's kind of the wrong question to ask now.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
You see, you're like, okay,
Yeah.
we're looking if we're asking like what explains first order phenomenon in the world, right? That doesn't get us anywhere for Kant, right?
Right.
But then there's this other thing, this transcendental thing, which we can't say much about, right?
Yeah, I wonder where you are. I mean, I see a lot of people object to the natural supernatural distinction. They don't think it's helpful. I think it can be helpful as long as like, we're willing to just be clear what we mean by naturalism. And this is where I think people like Gerson again are really helpful.
Yeah.
And he says, look, naturalism is kind of a package deal with these other commitments of nominalism and skepticism and reductivism and materialism, and he argues brilliantly that like, look, this really is a package deal, right? You can't sort of arbitrarily break these apart. And if you stand as opposed to all these, if you're anti-nominalistic, anti-relativistic, anti-skeptical, anti-reductivistic, anti-materialistic, and so on, then you're Platonic, right?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest the thesis of his latest book, which I cannot praise enough because it's so brilliant, is that philosophy is only compatible with Platonism. The conditions for philosophy are big tent Platonism. And of course, he considers Aristotle and those guys, those Platonists. And he goes to a great lengths at the books to show why, look, this is why, nominalism inescapably, leads to skepticism, and you can't break these things apart. And one of the biggest failures of so much contemporary philosophy is the attempted compromises between Platonism and naturalism.
Yeah.
And he says, it's time to stop playing this game. Stop trying to make these compromises, is what Gerson's ultimately up to. He's like, if you want philosophy, you need to be a Platonist. Naturalism is not compatible with philosophy. That's very provocative, but I'll tell you what, after spending a lot of time with this book, I think he's spot on, right?
Yeah. So I'm actually writing something about this week, but I don't find the natural supernatural distinction like very helpful anymore, right? Just because I don't think something like being a realist This is more cultural. It's more psychological, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
I don't think being a realist about forms is supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like I read this really interesting book recently, written by a guy, in part written by a guy named Jeffrey Kripal,
Mm-hmm.
who is a religious studies scholar, and it's a book on like paranormal, UFO stuff, all that. But the book is called Super Space Natural.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and um, one of the arguments in the book that Kripal's pushing is that what he's trying to do is to look at stuff not as natural or supernatural, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if it, like for him, it like maybe it turns out the natural is in fact much more exciting than like the modern scientific worldview would say.
Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, do you see what I mean?
Right.
And so for him, like he doesn't think like by discovering spooky things, you're not necessarily discovering something intervening from outside of nature.
Right. It's part of nature.
Yeah, you're
And
having your view of nature like revised.
yeah,
Do
and,
you see that?
and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
agree with that. Me
yeah,
and you are on the same page
yeah,
that nature is far more enchanted than the
yeah,
naturalist wants to
yeah,
admit.
and
My complaint is
yeah,
just that if you're a naturalist, like what is the naturalistic worldview? It's a worldview
yeah,
that has a certain epistemology, namely science rocks, and
yeah.
this epistemology, a
No, no,
broad
no.
scientism,
I'm not
constrains
denying that.
that
Yeah, I'm not
ontology.
denying.
Right.
I just think by like cashing in terms of naturalism,
Mm-hmm.
it assumes then the antidote to it is a supernaturalism,
Yeah.
wherein like this means something intervenes in it from the outside.
Yeah.
And then we're on this like bad path to all sorts of like interactionism and all this stuff, right?
Yes. 100%.
Rather
Yeah.
than admitting like the whole package was wrong and
Mm-hmm.
looking at like Aristotle's metaphysics, Plato's Timaeus,
Yeah.
right? These there's no supernatural in those things. There's just a spooky AF natural world
Yeah.
in those things. Do you see what I mean?
I do, and
Yeah,
I would just say,
yeah,
but that's just not naturalism in the
yeah, yeah,
contemporary.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? But for me though, you're not. I try not to like invoke supernatural,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
it seems to me like it partly
It
because of the
does.
C.S.
It's
Lewis
like
thing.
the
Yeah,
fingers poking in type of picture, which is
yeah.
definitely not the traditional theistic perspective, right?
No, and like
Where
when C.S. Lewis says, every thought is a miracle,
uh
like it's an intervention into the natural realm. And although at the time, even last book, like I went for that, right now, no, right now, then we're Cartesian now, right?
yes, yep,
And that was a mistake, right? That was a mistake. You know what I mean?
right.
Right.
Yeah, I think much better, much better. I don't know. I've been on just I guess a mission to try and get naturalists to better understand. This is going to sound so haughty and arrogant, to better
Yeah.
understand their actual tradition and be consistent with it. And
Sure.
if you want to start making nature more spooky, I'm all about it. Me and Jim love spooky nature, but
Yeah,
that's not naturalism, right?
Yeah.
Or at least it's abandoned the great tradition and what we're seeing as the primary motivations for naturalism, which is a particular epistemology, right?
Right.
If you want to give that up, I'm with
Yeah.
you. I think that should be
Yeah.
given up, right?
Yeah.
And let's make nature spooky and enchanted again. But
Yeah.
let's just say that whatever, naturalism in the contemporary sense
Yeah.
is inadequate. It's failed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm. And yeah,
Right,
there's
and-
just so much
and-
equivocation
Yeah.
going on.
And
right?
and this is kind of like a bigger thing for me in philosophical method too, is like as someone who does want to like have connections to the classical tradition, right?
Mhm.
I think like our distinction between natural and supernatural does not apply to anything in Aristotle.
Mm,
Like
mhm,
our
mhm.
distinct, like not the way you're making it, not the way like Gerson's making it, but like in the popular imagination, right?
Totally. Mhm,
It does not apply to Plato and Aristotle. Does not.
mhm,
Like
mhm,
there are not two worlds for them. There's one world. Okay.
mhm.
But it's a world, as in that last thing we talked about on here, like for Aristotle, surrounded by divinity. Right.
Yes, right.
You see what I mean? Right.
Yeah.
I think
What do you
that's-
think is
yeah,
what do you think is the best? Do you think the more I think about it, the more I think participation or modes of being? I think modes of being. I know there's people who are critical of modes of being. It just seems obvious to me that we just live in a world where being comes in many ways, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like a smile has a certain being, but it's less fundamental than the person in which
Yeah.
it inheres me.
Yeah.
And there's contingent being and there's necessary being. There's just being that comes in modes, and there's bounded being, and then ultimately, if you're a theist, there's unbounded being, right? And I think those are probably much more helpful distinctions. But I'd be
I like
curious.
polyvalence.
Polyvalence.
Being is polyvalent. I think
Mhm.
that's a Herbert Dreyfus thing, actually. It's
Yeah.
polyvalent. Yeah.
I like that too. I like that too.
Right. Because I like valence because it brings in the notion of value. It's many valued. Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And like partly what you're valuing is going to put you on a track to what you're seeing there, but that doesn't mean that stuff isn't there, right?
Yep.
But like it's the initial concern you have with being is gonna put you on rails as to what's seen there, right? And you might ask yourself other things one might value in being that would then put me on different rails to see what's there, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, we've gotten way off the primary subject, but it's been
it's all right, man. It's good stuff.
It's been fun. I hope people have enjoyed this introduction to transcendental arguments, and it fascinates me. I need to do much more. Just hasn't become like relevant for any of my primary. But I am actually curious now of what potential links might be between traditional natural theology and some of these, especially for the family of contingency arguments. Like I said, there's a number of those like possible cause arguments out there that are pretty interesting, but I'll have to spend more time thinking about them. In the meantime, Jim, what do you want to announce before we close this one out?
I don't think I have anything to announce right now.
Any new Substacks? Why don't we talk about our Substacks? What's going on there?
Well, there's still the one I did on capital and human obsolescence is up there. And the plan this week is to write up basically, the last time I chatted with you on Aristotle and philosophy of religion, right? And it had lots to do with stuff that we talked about today too, at the end. That's the next Substack. It's gonna be on Aristotle and myth. So
cool. Well, maybe we can revisit that then for an episode. Here, let me link them in the comments real quick. Here's my latest. Actually, went after Ed Fazer a little bit.
That's right. That's right.
Like Fazer's work, but I think that there's a mistake that him and a number of other Thomists make when arguing for the real distinction, and that's going from contingency to the real distinction. I don't think that works. I think you can go from real distinction to contingency, but not the other way around. So if people want to read that, they certainly can. And let me grab your Substack. I always forget what the thing is. Substack.
It's just JD Madden.
There it is. Got it.
JD Madden's newsletter. Sort of weird. Like once you've named a Substack, it doesn't seem like you can rename it, right?
I know. I'm so disappointed because mine was originally just Chronicles of Strength, kind of just like to catch the general fitness stuff too. But then I just only wrote philosophy stuff on there. So I'm like, this isn't like great. So it's like unofficial headline is a Journal of Absolute Truth, which I totally stole from you. And we were joking around one time.
Yeah.
But it's not the URL, which is annoying. But anyways,
there was in like the 60s and 70s a crazy like cult UFO group that had a journal called the Journal of Universal Truths.
I love it so
much. I know.
I love it.
I would like to actually see if we can subscribe to that and get some back issues.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, well, that would make some fun episodes, man. I would love to do it. In the meantime, people, please like, comment, share, subscribe. We'll catch you guys in the next video. Adios.